In this series, we're going to be commentating on a book called The Composition of the Pentateuch, Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis by Dr. Joel S. Baden. And he's a professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School, and he received his PhD from Harvard University in Hebrew Bible. And so this book touches on the most accepted hypothesis on how the Bible was written. And that hypothesis is known as the documentary hypothesis. And this is what we intend to cover in detail in this series of commentaries. And so what the book starts off with is the story of Joseph being sold into Egypt. And for centuries, people have been looking into this passage here, noticing the problems and the contradictions that it has within this particular story. And they've been trying to find ways to deal with it. And so this book starts out going over the story, which is what we're about to do now. And so we can find out what the problems are, and then later in the series, find out how the scholars came to resolve the problems within the story. So let's go into Genesis, the 37th chapter, and open it up and see if we can get some understanding.
Genesis 37, verse 18. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say, 'A savage beast devoured him.'" But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood, cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves," intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing. They took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, he said, "The boy is gone. Now what am I to do?" Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast." Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward.
So this is the story of Joseph being sold in the text as it is. And so many people looking at it, especially if you come from a Bible-based background, you may look at the story the way it's accustomed to being told, and you may not be able to see the problems in it. And that's because you have to step back, right, from the story and the way that you're used to seeing it and see it from a different set of lenses, right? Because it's the problems are there and they're obvious, but it's hidden in plain sight. And so we want to see it with a different set of lenses so we're not left in the dark, right? And so let's go through the story one more time and let's go through the key points so we can see it again with these new sets of lenses. Here we go.
Then they sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt.
So this is where the problems really start. When we get into verse 25, it says, they sat down to meal. Who's the they? It's talking about Joseph's brother. And then they saw the caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Pay attention to this. And they're bringing these items and to be taken into Egypt.
Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed.
So now in the story, we're seeing Judah convincing his brothers and saying, no, let's not kill Joseph, but instead, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, the same Ishmaelites that they saw in the caravan coming from Gilead. bringing the items to be taken to Egypt.
When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt.
Then it takes this sudden break in the story here, and it introduces the Midianite traders passing by, and the Midianite traders pull Joseph out of the pit, and the Midianite traders sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who then bring Joseph into Egypt.
The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward.
Then you get into verse 36 where it gets even crazier, because it now changes the story miraculously and all of a sudden says that the Midianites are the ones who now sell Joseph into Egypt, and they sell him to Potiphar. But prior to this, we see that it was supposed to be the Ishmaelites who then bring Joseph into Egypt. And if this wasn't problematic enough, it becomes even more of a problem when we go over just 2 chapters to Genesis 39 verse 1, where it says this.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there.
It does a complete change back to the Ishmaelites selling Joseph into Egypt, into the hand of Potiphar. So this is what the rabbis were wrestling with for many, many centuries, right? And we're going to go into some of these accounts on how they tried to fix this problem and some of the ways they went about trying to resolve these contradictions in here.
Interpreters have had to come to terms with these apparent contradictions and inconsistencies from the earliest stages of biblical interpretation to the present. For pre-critical interpreters, the unity of the text was never in question, and they were therefore forced to find ways to eliminate or otherwise explain away the narrative problems.
Now, when he's talking about the unity of the text, he's talking about the text just being one single composed document instead of many. And so over time, they've been wrestling with this because this is the narrative that they had, that it's just supposed to be one document, right? And what we'll find out later is that that's just not the case. And so in finding a way to deal with these contradictions, what they had to do is come up with some very elaborate stories to make this thing work.
In the 2nd century BCE book of Jubilees, the Midianites and the abduction of Joseph are removed from the story entirely. Joseph's brothers sell him to the Ishmaelites, who bring him to Egypt and sell him to Potiphar.
So let's go into the book of Jubilees right now, and let's get the exact account on how those writers tried to deal with the contradictions in this story. Here we go.
Jubilees 34, verse 11. And in the 7th year of this week, he sent Joseph to learn about the welfare of his brothers from his house to the land of Shechem. And he found them in the land of Dothan, and they dealt treacherously with him, and formed a plot against him to slay him. But changing their minds, they sold him to Ishmaelite merchants. And they brought him down into Egypt, and they sold him to Potiphar, the eunuch of Pharaoh, the chief of the cooks, priest of the city of Elu.
So we can see here that the writers in the book of Jubilees completely removed the Midianites from the account of Joseph being sold into Egypt. And according to them, all it was Joseph's brothers. They sold him to the Ishmaelite merchants, and the merchants took him to Egypt. But when we go back into the account, we just saw that that's not what it said, right? And this is how they're dealing with it in the earlier times. Like Dr. Joel Baden is saying, they're removing things out of the text in order to make that story work. Let's get some more.
This elimination of the narrative problem by means of the wholesale elimination of the Midianites is attested elsewhere in post-biblical texts of the early period. In Josephus's retelling, as in Jubilees, the brothers sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and they in turn sell him to Potiphar in Egypt. In the Testament of Joseph, Joseph is sold by his brothers to the Ishmaelites, but we find also a rather lengthy and convoluted story not found in Genesis, in which the trader to whom the Ishmaelites give Joseph for safekeeping is accused by Potiphar of having stolen him from Canaan.
So this is an extra biblical text called the Testament of Joseph, and it's one of 12 narratives in a book called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which is a Jewish text written around 100 to 200 BCE. And so in here, let's go into this account so we can see more specifically what they're trying to say happened to Joseph in his account of being sold into Egypt.
The Testament of Joseph 10 verse 6. I did not arouse myself with evil design, but honored my brothers, and out of regard for them, even when they sold me, I was silent rather than tell the Ishmaelites that I was the son of Jacob, a great and righteous man.
Right? And all that sounds great. But when you go back into Genesis 37, verse 28, it clearly says there that the Midianites passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit, and then they sold Joseph into the hands of the Ishmaelites. And so the biblical text as it stands is problematic, right, as we're seeing here. And so this is why there's so many attempts for people to try to take things out of the passages and rearrange the narrative of the story in order to deal with this particular problem. And so this way was acceptable up until a certain point. And so Dr. Joel Baden continues on in the book by going into this.
In later generations in the rabbinic sources, the simple removal of unwanted elements from the biblical text was no longer feasible, and new ways of interpreting away the contradictions were developed. From a midrashic exposition of the passage found in Genesis Rabbah, it is clear that the rabbis recognized that the notice in Genesis 37, verse 36, of the Midianites selling Joseph to Egypt rather than the Ishmaelites in verse 28 was a problem. Rather than eliminating one of the merchants from the story as had earlier interpreters, they multiplied them, creating a chain of sales from the brothers to Egypt that took into account all of the various named entities. How many deeds of sale were written on his account? Rabbi Hudan and Rabbi Huna disagree. Rabbi Hudan maintained 4. His brothers sold him to the Ishmaelites to the merchants to the Midianites, and the Midianites into Egypt. Rabbi Huna said 5. The Midianites to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians to Potiphar.
So the rabbis that came later on, they said, hold on. We can't keep deleting these characters out of these stories in order to deal with these biblical contradictions, right? Because they can clearly see that monster of a problem that's in Genesis 37 and in Genesis 39. So instead of deleting characters out of the biblical narrative, what they started to do is they started adding characters into the biblical narrative, right? In order to bridge the gap and fill in the gap and deal with those problems. And so you have Rabbi Hudan, who says that the brothers sold Joseph into the hands of the Ishmaelites. Then the Ishmaelites sold Joseph into the hands of the merchants. Then the merchants sold Joseph to the hands of the Midianites. Then the Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt, right? So that's 4 on that account. Then you have Rabbi Huna, who came along and said, hold on, I don't think it's just that. I think there's a little bit more, right? There's a little bit more selling that needs to take place in this account in order to make this work. So what does Rabbi Huna have? He has his brothers selling Joseph into the hands of the Ishmaelites. We have the Ishmaelites selling Joseph into the hands of the merchants selling Joseph into the hands of the Midianites selling Joseph into the hands of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians then selling Joseph into the hand of Potiphar, right? We have all types of wild stuff happening here. Who's the character that was introduced into the narrative? The merchant, which is nowhere to be found in any of these biblical narratives, right? When we go back to Genesis 37, verse 28, we are clear that it says that these are Midianite merchants or Midianite traders, right? It was very specific. But Rabbi Huna is trying to make it say Midianites, separation, merchants. All type of wild things and narratives that have to be created in order to make this account fit. That's what we're seeing happening right before our very eyes, right? Magic in the making.
This is, of course, classically midrashic, in that it sees a problem in the text, assumes that there is a gap in the narrative to be filled that would resolve the problem, and finds or creates within the text itself a possible, if not plausible, solution. Medieval Jewish exegetes similarly struggled with this text. Rashi followed the classical midrash. Quote, Midianites passed by. This was another caravan. Scripture indicates that he was sold many times, and the sons of Jacob drew up Joseph from the pit. And they sold him to the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites to Midianites, and the Midianites to Egypt.
So we had the earlier Jewish commentators, and now we have the medieval Jewish commentators who are struggling with this contradiction in the story of Joseph being sold into Egypt. And you can see from this long line of commentaries on it that this has been a long war going on about this particular passage in the text. And so you have the medieval French rabbi Rashi, who died in the 12th century, who is the same Rabbi Rashi who Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman talks about in his book, Who Wrote the Bible, who he talks about being especially skillful at creating these explanations and these narratives to fill in the gaps of these contradictory types of passages. And so here we're seeing a first-hand account on just how skillful Rabbi Rashi is. And so in his narrative, he's saying that it wasn't the Midianites who pulled Joseph out of the pit, but it was his brothers who pulled Joseph out of the pit. They sold him to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites sold him to the Midianites, and the Midianites took Joseph into Egypt. But even as fanciful and as clever as his narrative is, you still have that monster of a problem to deal with in Genesis 39, verse 1, where it comes back to saying that it's the Ishmaelites who took Joseph into Egypt. Right? So even as clever as Rabbi Rashi was, and as especially skillful as he was, he still couldn't properly deal with this part here. Now, we also have, in addition to him, another skillful rabbi who's good at doing this and creating these commentaries. And this is the infamous Abraham ibn Ezra. The same Abraham ibn Ezra who told people when they found out about these problems to keep quiet. It's the same one. Right, so let's go into Abraham ibn Ezra's account and let's see his up to bat on how he tried to crack the code. Here we go.
He understood, quote, when Midianite merchants passed by, end quote, in chapter 37, verse 28, as, quote, when the Ishmaelite merchants passed by them, end quote. He explained, quote, Scriptures refers to the Ishmaelites as Midianites, because the Midianites are called Ishmaelites. The book of Judges similarly says concerning the kings of Midian, because they were Ishmaelites, end quote. Rather than derive the equation of tribes from the genealogical information in Genesis, as had Rashbam, Ibn Ezra drew on a passage in Judges in which the kings of Midian, defeated by Gideon, are said to wear earrings because they were Ishmaelites, who tend to wear earrings, as the biblical author assumes everyone knows.
So Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra's attempt to reconcile the contradiction of Joseph being sold into Egypt was to make the Ishmaelites and the Midianites the same people, right? And in doing that, what he did was he used Judges 8, verse 24 and 25, where in those verses it alludes to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites as being the same. And to some extent, this is somewhat of a satisfactory explanation of the contradiction in Genesis, but when you go into Genesis 37, it does not say that, right? It makes the distinction clearly that there's Ishmaelites and that there's Midianites. And so if we use Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra's rationale by saying that they're the same, it begs further questions of, are the Midianites and the Ishmaelites always the same people, right? And if not, how do you distinguish between when they're separate people and when they're the same? Because the Bible doesn't say explicitly these are the same people in these verses, but they're not in other verses, right? It doesn't say that. So someone would have to come along and invent those guidelines on telling when to distinguish between the two tribes and when they're the same. And after they invent those guidelines, then everyone would have to agree upon them. Because like I said, those guidelines are not in the Bible, right? So these are some of the problems that come along with Abraham ibn Ezra's attempt. Although he did do a better job than most of the other people who tried to take a crack at this puzzle here.
Ibn Ezra's solution is well grounded in the biblical text, but is no less midrashic for that. Despite their adherence in principle to Peshat, the plain meaning of the text and its immediate narrative context, here they were forced into the standard midrashic technique of finding a single verse elsewhere in the Bible, unrelated to the passage at hand, in order to create a reading that eliminates the textual problem. In so doing, they and their predecessors actually further underscored the textual difficulty.
So this is what we just talked about. When you take unrelated text and you swing it over into other texts that are unrelated to deal with contradictions, then you create other problems. Like we just said, when do you know when the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are the same people? When do you know when they're separate? The answer is simple. When you're using the midrashic method, you know when to use them when it's convenient for the narrative that you're trying to convey, right? That's plain and simple. And so, for example, when I was in the Israelites, what we would do, we would take a verse like Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, and the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. We'd take that Egypt right there, that word in Egypt, we'd turn it from a literal Egypt into a metaphoric Egypt. How do we do that? Go over to Exodus 20, verse 2, where it says that Egypt is the house of bondage, right? So you take that meaning, bring it back over to Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, and now you flip that from a literal Egypt into a metaphoric Egypt. But the question begs, how did one decide when to make that a metaphoric Egypt and a literal Egypt, right? The answer is simple. When it was convenient, right? When you want to make it say something like being the house of slavery, then you make it say that it's a metaphoric Egypt, right? When you want to keep it as a literal Egypt, as in all the other passages, then you just keep it as Egypt, right? So in Deuteronomy 28, verse 68, and the Lord shall bring thee into this metaphoric Egypt or slavery with these literal ships, right? You keep the ships as literal, right? You can pick and swap and move things and maneuver things however you want to maneuver them. These are just personal opinions, right? You can do that, just like we see Abraham, Ibn Ezra doing. You can do that, but the reality is that these are just personal opinions and personal interpretations. And when you start to see that, then you realize that, everyone just has their own opinion. Everyone just interprets different for whatever mission or for whatever message it is that they're trying to convey, right? And that's what it boils down to, and we have to understand it in those terms, right? And then you can free yourself from thinking that this is just the word of God, where you can see clearly these are the words of these people who are interpreting it, right? As we're seeing Abraham, Ibn Ezra doing in his shot up to bat. And so this is what many of these rabbis also are doing, this midrashic type of method, in order to deal with that contradiction that we're talking about in Genesis 37 and Genesis 39, right? So let's continue going.
Nevertheless, the two opposing interpretations of Rashbam and Ibn Ezra became the standard possibilities for understanding this passage. Either the Midianites sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, in which case we are left with the problem of 37 verse 36, or the brothers sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, in which case we have to understand the Ishmaelites and Midianites to be the same people, despite their different names and moments of appearance in the narrative. Each solution has its problems.
So both of these interpretations have their own problems. If someone is to say that the Midianites are the ones who sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, then the Ishmaelites brought Joseph into Egypt, then you're left with that monster of a problem in Genesis 37 verse 36, where it clearly states that the Midianites are the ones that brought Joseph into Egypt and sold him to Potiphar, right? And if someone else comes along and says, that's not it, Joseph's brothers are the ones that sold him into the hands of the Ishmaelites, well, now you have to make the Ishmaelites and the Midianites the same people, right? And we can see clearly in the chapter of Genesis 37 that it's making a clear distinction between the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, right? So that would have to be someone's own personal revelation and someone's own personal narrative that they're fitting into the text, right? Just like Abraham, Ibn Ezra did, right? And people can do that, right? There's not a problem with doing that, but we have to understand that that's just their opinion, right? And someone else can come along with another opinion, and someone else can come along with a different story, just like we saw in Flavius Josephus. Then we see in the book of Jubilees, the Testament of Joseph. All people can come up with their own narratives in order to fix that problem. But the problem in the text as it stands remains, right? And I think most of us can see this by now. And so this is a problem that many of the rabbis, the scribes, the interpreters, and people who commentate on these particular passages, they saw. And so because of this problem, some of the scribes even went as far as doing this.
Text critical investigation reveals that at least some scribes involved in the transmission of the Septuagint were also disturbed by the apparent inconsistency in this story and sought to correct it by changing Ishmaelites to Midianites or vice versa. Thus, for Midianites in 37 verse 28, two marginal glosses in manuscripts from the 10th and 11th centuries read Ishmaelites. One manuscript omits Ishmaelites from the verse, and one from the 12th century creates a wonderful hybrid form, Ishmaelites. The same sources, plus at least one other from the 10th century, replace Midianites with Ishmaelites in 37 verse 36 as well.
So we can see just how puzzling and problematic this biblical story was to the rabbis and to the scribes, to the point where the scribes are now removing pieces out of the text, right? They're now making the Ishmaelites turn into the Midianites. Some of the scribes are turning the Midianites into the Ishmaelites. Then you have some of them that are creating these hybrid names, the Ishmaelites, right? They're using all type of cheat codes in order to try to crack the code, right? But eventually they were found out, right? People discovered that they were changing the names. in order to fix this problem in Genesis 37. And so for many centuries prior, people operated under the assumption that the text was a unified text, right? A single source, and did not have multiple sources. And it was not until later investigators came, noticing the contradictions, the inconsistencies, and the problems, that they began to question this unified theory and assumption. So in part 2, what we're going to be doing is going over what many scholars believe to be the 4 sources that go together to create the biblical text, and which eventually will give us some understanding later on in the series on how to crack the code of the story of Joseph being sold into Egypt. Right? So I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 2 in this series.